As the Denver Broncos prepare for mandatory minicamp this week, we take a look at three players who could be sleepers for the active roster, maybe ahead of the regular season. We'll dive deeper then, and we'll tell you why on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for taking time out of your day to tune in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. And shout out to all the everydayers out there as well. Make sure you subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, and more every single day, all year long. I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, Broncos reporter for Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger, site expert, predominantly orange.com. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon today to get started. And as mandatory minicamp kicks off this week, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in Dove Valley, we're going to take a little bit of an early look because there's so much that happened between minicamp throughout training camp and the preseason, but taking a look right now a little bit early in the offseason at some potential sleepers that are on the roster already. Could they maybe make the roster when the season comes around? It's a great question to throw out there. So, Sayre, let's kind of kick off the conversation here with a guy who was an undrafted rookie free agent last year for the Broncos, who made the roster, who we saw in the preseason make some explosive plays downfield. Anytime you threw the ball his way, good things happened. And that is Jalen Virgil, who has a chance as well in a deep loaded wide receiver room right now. He's going to have his work cut out for him, but he is a potential sleeper here on this roster.
He is, Cody, and it's going to be exciting to see what he can do in his second NFL offseason right after we saw him go out and make play after play in the preseason last year, forced his way onto the roster, really did a great job. And I think when he got his opportunities, you and I were kind of like, wait, why hasn't this guy been getting more opportunities, right? It wasn't just the big play against the Titans, although that was kind of the proof of concept of like, man, get Jalen Virgil some more snaps, get him some more opportunities. This guy can really fly, and I think that's the one thing that sets him apart. He is a sleeper at this point, I would say, even though he did make the roster last year because, well, you got Tim Patrick coming back. You added Marvin Mims into the mix. You've got other guys out there. But as of right now, with obviously Marquez Callaway is another one out there playing wide receiver for the Broncos now, but Jalen Virgil has a chance in this offseason, I think, to kind of go from being sleeper to like a solidified piece of the roster, right? I mean, it kind of feels like maybe those top 6 spots at wide receiver are full if you count KJ Hamler in there. But Cody, right now, it's kind of Marquez Callaway, is he a lock? I would say probably, but at the same time, it's like, okay, where can somebody like Jalen Virgil kind of fit into this conversation? Because I think there has to be one. Last year, it kind of felt like, well, the Jalen Virgils of the world, the Brandon Johnsons of the world, even the Kendall Hintons of the world, going to be tough for those guys to make it on this Denver Broncos roster. And they all three played pretty crucial roles throughout last season. So maybe these wide receivers, it feels deeper than you would maybe, I guess, be able to project other guys on the roster like a Jalen Virgil, but maybe there's a spot for him.
And that's a hard conversation right now to have because when you look at it on paper, the depth, it's just like, where is he going to fit in? And I think the larger conversation needs to be had here is when you look at guys like Brandon Johnson, Kendall Hinton, and you factor in Jalen Virgil, maybe even little Jordan Humphrey. We're going to throw him in there. Guys like Montrell Washington, some other names that are out there. How can these guys separate themselves from one another? I will say this, though. I don't know if many Broncos fans recall, but Jalen Virgil actually stepped into a pivotal role on special teams as a gunner, had a couple of tackles and was consistent. He was making his hay more so on special teams than he was at wide receiver. So to me, there is value there. He has speed, Sayre. Let's be very frank about that. He's probably got some speed on the team alongside guys like Marvin Mims and KJ Hamler that it's just like, all right, I don't know if there's anybody else on the team that is as fast as Jalen, KJ, Marvin Mims at this point as well. I don't know where Montrell Washington maybe fits into the mix here, but those are the top 3 guys on this team right now that are probably projected to be the fastest, and they all maybe kind of play a little bit of a similar role in terms of play style, size, and stature of that nature there. So for a guy like Russell Wilson, look, you get Cortland Sutton, you have Jerry Jeudy, you have Tim Patrick, KJ Hamler, I'm going to throw him in there, Marquez Callaway. There's 5 guys who are legitimate options there. Marvin Mims, who's obviously going to have a key role this season. Aside from that, this is where Jalen Virgil, I mean, really throughout OTAs and mini camp, and then coming up in training camp, he's going to have to stack. And all these guys I feel like we're going to talk about, they have to stack good performances on top of one another, not just in practice, but also in preseason games in order to really stand out. Now, there is the opportunity that the practice squad is available, but, for a guy like Jalen Virgil, who the Broncos last year, Sayre, they feared that if they released him, some other team would pick him up, and he made the 53-man roster. Maybe that's not the situation this year around the NFL, right? But then again, there are teams who are always watching for cuts in the preseason specifically. Jalen Virgil, like I said, he has to continue to make plays on special teams, and he has to make plays once again in preseason on the offensive side of the ball.
And let's just say that does happen, right? Let's say he starts going out there, making big plays once again, putting him in that conversation of guys like we've seen, like even just him last year, but other guys in recent years, Cody, where we're just like, remember Trinity Benson a couple years back? Everyone's like, well, the Broncos just can't cut him, right? There's no way they can cut him. He's obviously made the team. We had him put in our rosters on Sharpie, and then all of a sudden you trade him to Detroit. And I'm not saying you trade Jalen Virgil, but maybe you start to consider the beyond 2023 situation here. Look, Jalen Virgil is going to be under contract for a couple more years as a former undrafted free agent signing. They get the 3-year deals, right? And they get obviously the restricted free agency or exclusive rights, depending on if you bounce up and down at all. But he's basically, the point is he's under team control. So if the Broncos see him go out there and start making a bunch of plays, did they then start looking at players who aren't in their 2024 plans and maybe start to float those guys' names out there in trade talks and let Jalen Virgil steal a roster spot? I think that's the part of this. Like you see, Cody, if you're watching us on YouTube, you see we're in these boxes here. If we expand the box a little bit and we start to think outside this box of like, well, Jalen has to either be one of the top 6 guys or he's not making the team. What if the team's like, he is a top 6 guy, and this guy that you didn't think, maybe a Sutton or a Tim Patrick, they're going to get traded because Jalen is such a big part of what we want to do, not just now, but going into the future. It's kind of it's a conversation that you don't necessarily want to have because you don't want to see those guys. You want to see all these guys make the team and be able to contribute and be able to keep your best guys on the practice squad. Like, I get that, but what happens if, right? Those are the big question marks, I think. So that's why he's a sleeper, right? That's why we're talking about this, because he didn't make enough plays last year to say guaranteed top 6 receiver on the team. But at the same time, he made enough plays last year where you're like, is he a top 6 player at wide receiver on the team? That's why I think he's one of the most intriguing guys on the roster.
Appalachian State, they produce some really, really talented players in the NFL level. So we'll see what is in store here for Jalen. Obviously, after making the 53-man roster during his rookie season, it's all about the path, right? And even Sean Payton will always go back to it. Says it's not about your path in terms of how you got here. Now that you're here, make the most of the opportunity. So my eyes this week during mandatory minicamp, I'm going to keep my eye on Jalen Virgil a little bit as the Broncos go through practice at the Centura Training Center in Dove Valley. We'll have you covered every step of the way Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday as well for post OTA recaps, mandatory minicamp recaps as well. You get all that here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. We're going to continue our conversation on potential sleepers on the Broncos roster right now on the 90-man roster overall. We maybe take a look at the tight end position and look at that position all across the board. Does it make sense for this next guy to maybe make the roster? We'll talk about that a little bit more on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of the show is brought to you by our friends over there, FanDuel Sportsbook. Make a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs, because right now new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. There's no better place to bet all the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA.
Have the Denver Broncos found a potential sequel to the Eric Saubert era, Cody? I think, Eric Saubert was one of those guys that you could have considered him over the last couple years, the ideal, maybe the quintessential even roster sleeper. Now that he's moved on, obviously, to the Miami Dolphins, he's going to be playing for Mike McDaniel, and Vic Fangio obviously is there as well. It's going to be interesting to see how exactly the Broncos replace him. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, you're listening to this, you're like, well, the Broncos signed Chris Manhertz. They traded for Adam Troutman. They've got, obviously, Alberto, and they've got Greg Dulcich. But I'm here to tell you that the potential replacement for Eric Saubert is this guy who tried out for the team at rookie minicamp initially, got signed a couple weeks later. His name is Tommy Hudson, Cody, and I think he's one of those top sleepers on the Denver Broncos roster in 2023. We don't talk about him much on the show. Heck, we may not have even brought him up until this point. So, kudos to Tommy Hudson. We're joining the club here. I want to see what this guy can do, Cody. He's got some NFL experience, played a little bit for the Titans, and he's got a specific skill set that I think could really lend towards him potentially getting onto the regular season 53-man roster.
And that's where everything right now is super important. Like mini camp, training camp, preseason, these reps matter because I think it's easy for us to say right now, okay, hey, Greg Dulcich is going to be a major part of the Broncos offense this upcoming season. He's probably the one guy you can consider as a lock. But I also look at maybe everybody else at the tight end position. I mean, realistically, everyone's on a one-year contract outside of Greg Dulcich, if I'm not mistaken. So there is competition, there's moving pieces, and how many tight ends will Sean Payton keep on his active roster this upcoming season? There's going to be competition between Manhertz and Troutman and Alberto and now Tommy Hudson. But here's the thing, Tommy Hudson, as you mentioned, he does have some size to him where he can kind of be a little bit of an all-around player. He's a guy who can block, play a little bit of that wing type role, and also play inline. You can maybe put him on the outside, but I think his strengths are really suited to being an inline guy or an offset wing where you can bring him back underneath the formation. And on top of that, he can be a guy who plays a lot on special teams. You need big bodies like that to be able to run down there. And also in your return game, you need guys to be able to help set up returns for your return option there. We'll see how much maybe returns change this year in terms from a kick return standpoint because of the new rule that has been passed. I can tell you this, it's hard, I imagine, to try to coach that, especially if you want a good return. All you have to do if someone tries to pin you, which, hey, this rule change actually benefits the Broncos there because of all the times where teams kick the ball short to force Denver to return, you could just, hey, fair catch, bang, 25-yard line. All right, there you go. I mean, the strategy on it, it's frustrating for a special teams coordinator, but, if you're not a very good return team, which Denver has not been a good return team for quite some time, then it makes it a little bit of an easier task to maybe, hey, we can overcome this with this. But for Tommy Hudson, his size has been on display during Broncos OTAs. As you mentioned, he's not a guy we've really talked about much here on the podcast because really the focus has been on Greg Dulcich, Alberto, Adam Troutman, and just even Chris Manhertz as well. For me, I don't know how it's going to play out, especially when you consider Denver also has a fullback on the roster as well, Michael Burton. I almost said Michael Bolton there, but no, Burton. Yeah. So on top of there, I don't know. I mean, to be honest with you, I have a hard time seeing him making the active roster, but he does have the size and he does have some of the physical traits to make the roster, though. So that's why I think he's perfect to be deemed a sleeper candidate here for the Broncos on the offensive side of the ball.
And I go back to a comment that Sean Payton made a few weeks back, Cody, where he said something to the effect of, we don't want to have guys here at our mini camp or training camp or whatever and let those guys go and then see them go off and have success elsewhere. And I think with that quote and context in mind, it kind of amplifies the signing of Tommy Hudson just a little bit, right? Because, well, the Broncos did let him go. They tried him out a few weeks back at I believe it was that initial rookie mini camp. He came in as one of those veteran tryout players, and the Broncos let him go. And it was a couple weeks in between that they decided, you know what, we better bring that guy in. I think that speaks kind of volumes to the fact that maybe they were dwelling on it. They're like, I really liked what that guy did, or I think he's got the ability to bring this to our offense or our special teams or both. It's kind of one of those interesting things, right? It's like the Saubert pickup back a couple years ago where it was kind of like, oh yeah, he's going to be there. He knows the tight ends coach, Wade Harmon, right? I mean, it was just like any obscure connection we could find to be like, oh yeah, it's interesting that he's here. And then all of a sudden we see him play and he's like, wow, Saubert might actually be one of our better like blocking tight ends. And then all of a sudden he gets on the roster and all of a sudden he's playing a crucial role in the regular season. And then last year playing all 17 games, right? So I'm not saying Tommy Hudson's going to come in here and start all 17 games by any means, but hey, I mean, look at he can block, and you go on Twitter, search his name in there, click on the videos tab. You're going to see footage of him pass protecting. You're going to see footage of him paving the way for Derrick Henry in Tennessee. You're going to see footage of him making a play after the catch. I mean, there's little pieces, little nuggets there. When he got opportunities, he made the most of them. So I'm kind of digging this guy, Cody, as a bit of a sleeper for the Broncos roster right now.
Oh, and I think the thing about Saubert as well, going back to that point, remember in preseason, he was making these catches, yards after catch. He was a hard guy to bring down because of his size. And we're like, hey, who is this guy? Yeah, maybe Tommy Hudson could emerge to be maybe that guy for the Broncos here. But I think the biggest thing is he is going to have to beat out Alberto. He's going to have to beat out Chris Manhertz. He's going to have to beat out Adam Troutman here if they want the job. And maybe we also need to take a step back here and say, okay, considering the injuries that have impacted the Broncos tight end position in the last couple of years, could Denver maybe keep 4 guys on there? And if so, can he be one of the top 4? Greg Dulcich, in my opinion, is a lock for the roster. So everything else right now behind Dulcich is really up for grabs. Everything is competition based here going forward. And so for Tommy Hudson, he's a young guy. Now, for the Broncos pro personnel department, they obviously had him in. They had, the trial, as you mentioned, but they also had him on the radar in a sense of saying, hey, can this guy help us in this department? You look at maybe Sean Payton, how well he studies the game, how well he knows tight ends. What is it specifically that a guy like Sean Payton sees in Tommy Hudson? If I get the chance, I'll ask him this week at Broncos practice after it concludes and when he does his press conference. What was it that you saw in Tommy Hudson and maybe just his overall forecast of the tight end position going into training camp? Because, hey, this is it. Mandatory minicamp this week. You get 3 days of practice, and then you're off for about 40 days or something along those lines, and then it is training camp time. And from that point, everything's going to be very busy, very hectic here for us, very hectic for everybody in Broncos country, but the excitement is creeping up here once again for everybody in Broncos country.
It is, Cody, man. Just you even talking about that, I can already picture in my head just talking about day one training camp observations, and I can't wait. So I'm excited. But you know what? The interim, the in between, that's going to be exciting here as well, because you and I both know, and for the everydayers, the everyday listeners of the show, they know, like we call this time of year separation season. That's when we want to bring our best possible content, and that's why we're talking about guys like Tommy Hudson and Jalen Virgil, and hey, maybe a sleeper defensive back that you need to kind of just keep in the back of your mind here as the Broncos build this new look defense under Vance Joseph.
We continue the conversation here on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Perfect tease there by Sayre Bedinger about a Broncos defensive back. You'll get that on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. Real quick, let me tell you to check out the Locked On Nuggets podcast hosted by Adam Adez and Matt Moore. On Monday, it will be Game 5 of the NBA Finals. The Denver Nuggets are up 3-1 against the Miami Heat. Can they close it out at home? Can they win their first ever NBA championship in front of a jam-packed Ball Arena? Make sure you tune into the Locked On Nuggets podcast for all the preview and lead up to the game, and after the game for all the recap. Will the Denver Nuggets be the 2023 NBA champions? Check out the Locked On Nuggets podcast to find out and more. This next player that we're going to talk about on today's episode, Locked On Broncos, in terms of looking at potential sleepers on this roster right now who are currently on the roster, who maybe can make a little bit of noise and make the regular season roster when the time comes. Someone we're going to have our eyes on during training camp, during the preseason. That's what you're going to get here on Locked On Broncos. Real quick, just want to say thank you so much to everybody in Broncos country for tuning in, making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. Sayre, let's talk about this player right here, Ja'Quan McMillian at the cornerback position. Why might he be a sleeper at the position? And I think some people, when they hear that we said, hey, Ja'Quan McMillian is a sleeper, they're going to say, well, he started a game last year for the Broncos in the regular season. He did start. He started in an impact game. For the Broncos, it's like, hey, don't get swept in the AFC West. Get your first AFC West win of the season. But more importantly, you're playing the Los Angeles Chargers, who for some dumb reason decided to play their starters in a game when they already had seeding and the playoffs already locked up at that point. Ja'Quan McMillian drew the task of covering a guy like Mike Williams, and he held his own. We could even make the argument. Got robbed of an interception in that very game. So how might Ja'Quan McMillian be a sleeper here on this roster? I think a lot of people are going to forget about that performance, right? And it's not that it wasn't a performance worth remembering. It's just, hey, last year really doesn't matter now. With Sean Payton coming into the mix here for the Broncos, anything that happened last year, as Sean Payton said, it's in the rearview mirror. So how can Ja'Quan McMillian maybe solidify himself as a guy who can establish himself as a key depth option at that position, and maybe even a guy who can start at some point if you need to? We've already seen he stepped up. It's small sample size, but he did a pretty dang good job there, all things considered. So, Sayre, Ja'Quan McMillian being a potential sleeper in this situation here for the Broncos, to you, what stands out about him and why might he be a sleeper in your eyes?
For Cody, for those who are listening only and not watching, I just reached around back behind me and I grabbed the ball. I got my hands on the ball. That's what Ja'Quan McMillian does exceptionally well. He gets his hands on the football. A boatload of interceptions at East Carolina, became an All-American as a cornerback at East Carolina, which, man, that's not easy to do, right? You got all these Power 5 colleges and all these 5-star players to go up against, not to mention he's what, 5'9", 5'10"? I mean, he's not the biggest guy out there, but you know what? He gets his hands on the ball. And as a defensive back, Cody, you get your hands on the ball, I mean, you could play. You can play for a while. If you can get your hands on the ball consistently, make plays on the ball, you got those instincts. That's what we saw against the Chargers, right? It wasn't just the great matchup that he had in an opportunity at the end of a regular season against Mike Williams or Keenan Allen or whoever was out there for the Chargers. It was the fact that he went out there and he utilized those ball skills, those instincts, attacking the football with confidence. You can do that. You can play inside or out at the NFL level. You can play for pretty much any scheme, right? So I'm not saying Chris Harris Jr., Cody, but I'm saying, I mean, this is a type of guy who has that kind of confidence in himself at the position. He believes when the ball is in the air, he can get to it. He can make a play on it. And he did it consistently in college. And then he got one opportunity as an NFL rookie last year. He got one shot. And what did he do? He did a lot of the same, right? And he should have had a pick six in that game on a brilliant interception, which you and I are never going to let go on this show. We're going to say it till we're blue in the face. So I know you've gotten to see Ja'Quan out there at OTAs. I think the listeners would love to know if he's been impressive. I know you can only tell us so much, but how has he looked as in his second year now, and with Christian Parker again as his DBs coach?
I think it's big that Christian Parker is back for a guy like Ja'Quan, because you have the advocacy and they're carrying over a lot of the same terminology. That way it makes it easier for, the guys on the field coverage wise to know, okay, hey, we have similar terms, but this is what it's going to look like under Vance Joseph's defensive coordination now. On top of that, I will say this too about Ja'Quan. I mean, he has demonstrated the ability to play on the outside. He's demonstrated the ability to play on the inside as well. And you know this as well as I do, considering, some of the injuries. Look, K1 played banged up last year. He's one of the toughest guys on the team. But, if you lose him to an injury, okay, you have another guy like Asang Bassi, right? But you also have a guy like Ja'Quan McMillian who has already proven he can step in. You have two guys there, in my opinion, number 34 and number 35, who can play that role inside the slot if you need them to do just that. And you have a guy in Ja'Quan McMillian in the event Damari Mathis were to get hurt or anyway, you have a guy who can go in and start there. Now, for me, I think the bigger question is, okay, with the draft addition of Riley Moss, does this maybe change the optics on a guy like Ja'Quan McMillian? I say yes, it does, because you bring in a guy, you draft a guy in round number 3. That means you really do have some pretty big expectations for him. Maybe not necessarily right away as a rookie in terms of the defensive side of the ball, but it just makes it even harder now for a guy like Ja'Quan and some of the other guys on the back end of the cornerback roster. Another guy we could even mention as a potential sleeper, Delonte Hood, who was on the roster toward the end of last season for Denver and has been making some plays as well during OTA practices. So for me, you have to have cornerback depth. You and I have talked about this specifically. Hey, Surtain's great. You don't necessarily have to worry anywhere where Surtain is lined up on the field. Damari has proven to be a starter in the NFL. He had a pretty good, rookie season. Can he carry that over here into year 2? You have a veteran guy in Tremont Smith who, I think the optics, you don't really expect him to play much in terms of in the rotation. So that's where guys like Ja'Quan McMillian, Riley Moss, these guys really are going to compete for those next reps to be in the rotation here on the defensive side of the ball for Denver. Ja'Quan, I think, with his ability to play, and not only that, despite him being 5'9", to be able to play big against a guy like Mike Williams, who, how many times, Sayre, have we seen him rise up above defenders, smaller guys in particular, and just make them look foolish? Ja'Quan understands how to get in position, how to get in phase, and time things perfectly. And he did that in that game against the Chargers. Now, he's going to have to, the next game that he plays, whether it's the preseason, whether it's the regular season, whatever he may have, He's going to have to continue to build on that because you can't just live off of last year's game. There is impressiveness there. That's when you watch it and Sean Payton watches the film, you say, this guy has potential, but I want to see if he can continue to do just that. I'll go back to the point that I just made as well. I do think having Christian Parker back is so big for a guy like Ja'Quan McMillian because Parker has been instrumental since he's been in Denver under 3 different coaching staffs now in developing the cornerback position, developing those players at not only at cornerback, but also at safety as well.
And that's going to be, like you said, really big for his advocacy to make the roster, right? Because I'm guessing, I don't know this for a fact, but I would be willing to bet that Christian Parker is going to have some type of influence in how that roster is constructed in terms of the defensive backfield. Because why? We've mentioned this before on the show, but you really want to make sure the best position coaches that you want to make sure that those guys have guys on the roster and on the practice squad that they can pour into and develop. We've seen rapid development from guys like Pat Surtain and Caden Stearns and Damari Mathis and a host of other young players at the position. We've also seen guys that were in Denver before Christian Parker getting a lot better since he got there. So that's something that I think you really need to make sure you do is let him help you invest in these guys by helping you pick the guys that you keep on the team. I'm not saying he's going to pick the 53-man roster. I'm not saying he's even going to pick all 10 or 11 defensive backs. What I am saying is I think if you're talking about back end guys, you're talking about somebody like a Ja'Quan McMillian, and you're talking about, is this guy one of 53? I think Christian Parker's opinion should weigh heavily in that. And I think Ja'Quan McMillian stands a really good shot as of right now. If he can progress from year one, I think he might become uncuttable before we know it.
Broncos Country, do you agree with us? Do you disagree? Make sure if you're watching on YouTube, you comment down below, interact with other members in Broncos Country as well. If you're listening wherever you get your podcast, make sure you tweet us on Twitter at Cody Roark NFL, at Sayre Bedinger, at Locked On Broncos. For all you everydayers out there, tomorrow's episode of the show, what you can expect from Sayre and myself, we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about 3 players that are currently on the Broncos roster who have the biggest odds right now stacked against them going into next season in terms of making it onto the active roster. We'll dive deep into that and much more on tomorrow's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.